Senator Russell, face the nation. Through the eyes of this live television camera in Washington, D.C., you're about to see Senator Richard B. Russell, chairman of the Armed Services Committee of the United States Senate, face the nation with questions from veteran correspondents representing the American press here in the national capital. And now today's moderator of Face the Nation, pinch hitting for Mr. Ted Koop, is the Associate Director of CBS Public Affairs, Stuart Nobens.
Senator Russell, we're particularly delighted that you're here to face the nation for one of your infrequent broadcasting appearances. You occupy a unique position in the Senate. You work as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, and of the Joint Atomic Energy Committee, put you in a very important position of influence in the Senate. And also, your work, I think, deals with a great many of the questions that the American people are asking. How good is our defense? Are we maintaining a leading position of strength in comparison with the Russians? What about the defense appropriations and manpower? Your opinions are very highly respected, sir, and we'd like to hear them on these matters and on other matters of vital importance to all of us. To ask you about them, here is our panel of newsmen. William S. White, Washington correspondent for the New York Times, Edwin Hackinson, Washington Bureau of the Associated Press, and Clark Molinoff, Washington correspondent for the Des Moines Register and Tribune. And now with the first question, here's Mr. White.
Senator Russell, I think it's probably generally agreed now that one of the biggest things left in Congress is the issue on which you've been so active, and that's the matter of creating an adequate military reserve. I'd like my first question to be very general, to ask you this, whether you think, in view of the circumstances now, the fact that the House has brought out one bill, you brought out another bill in the Senate committee, whether there is a good chance that we will actually get a truly adequate bill in this Congress.
Well, Mr. White, I do not doubt that we will get a bill that will give us a better reserve than we have at the present time. Out of the conferences that will be held next week between the representatives of the Senate and the representatives of the House of will come an effective reserve bill. As to whether it will be adequate or not, I cannot say. I personally doubt that we will ever have a truly adequate reserve that would be strong enough to justify any reduction in our regular establishment until we have some form of universality in the training and service of our young men.
Senator, of course, as you know, the reductions that you mentioned have, in fact, already been made in the Army and in the Marine Corps both, and granting that this is the state of fact now, that they have been made, I'd like to ask particularly about one feature of the bill that you have brought out in the Senate, which, as I understand it, really has the effect of postponing compulsory military reserve service for about 2 years. Is that correct?
Well, it defers the compulsion of reserve service for a period of 2 years. I don't think that it postpones it, because there is no duty at the present time. We have millions of young men, 2.5 to 3 million of them, who have gone into our armed services voluntarily, who had worked out their future careers based on what they were going to do when they had finished serving either 2 years in the Army or 3 years in the Marine Corps or 4 years in the Navy and in the Air Force. And I thought it was very unjust to those young men, some of whom would be discharged within the next 2 or 3 months, to say, no, you're not through. You've served 4 years, but you still have an additional obligation to remain in the ready reserve, attend 48 drill periods a year, and go off for 2 weeks of active duty. I thought that was particularly unfair, because we are now reaching a period where we will have hundreds of thousands of young men who will not have served any in our armed services, who will not be called on either through selective service or otherwise by any compulsion to serve. And it's not fair to let one man, when you get one man, to apply the compulsion to him time and again, when another American who has the same stake in our country as the young man in the service that he has, let him escape altogether.
Yes, Senator, if that compulsion is held off for 2 years, aren't you relying a great deal on the volunteer aspect of the reserve program? And what is there in this one that's considerably different from the old reserve program?
Well, there are 2 or 3 things that will make the reserve more attractive. Under the present reserve program, the reservists might be liable for induction under a number of circumstances where they've never done any prior service. under the new bill, if they enlist in the reserves, they are exempt from induction into the standing armed forces, and that will prove quite an incentive. We filled up the National Guard with a similar provision.
Senator,
It calls
doesn't
them
the
to
point
enlist.
I'm sorry, the point I meant to ask about, doesn't your bill, quite apart from people who've already served in the Army, in fact give this exemption from the compulsory reserve for 2 years for people only now entering the Army?
It does.
Well, that is what I wanted to ask about.
Yes, if a man enters the Army tomorrow, he would not have any compulsory reserve duty.
Then in the net, it is fair
He
to
would
say...
be in the standby reserve. Understand, Mr. White, every man who serves now
Yes.
has an 8-year obligation for regular service and in the reserve. The only question at issue is as to whether he shall be in the standby reserve and not be compelled to do these 48 drills and 2 weeks of active duty each year, but will be subject to call in case of national emergency, or whether he'll have that requirement. They're all in the reserve.
I wanted to ask this, Senator. The whole point of my question was that I think most people would assume that in 2 years' time, we either will have had a fairly genuine relaxation of world tension or that things might be quite bad indeed. And that's why I wanted to ask this question, whether this bill does not, in fact, more or less put off the compulsory reserve feature for 2 years for both classes of people.
It doesn't put it off, Mr. White. It just doesn't impose it, because there's no obligation now. It just says to a young man who has not yet served, that now you know exactly what your obligations will be. You have all of these choices, whether you'll go in the National Guard, or whether you'll go in the Ready Reserve, or whether you'll take the 6 months training with a limitation of 7.5 years of active reserve duty, or whether you still want to go into the Army for 2 years, and then have your 3 years of Ready Reserve, active reserve training. It lets a man go into it with his eyes open. It doesn't say you've done your planning, but now we're going to tear all those plans to pieces and impose on you a new obligation. And that was a provision of the bill that I objected to.
I see.
Senator Russell, right along that same subject, do you think the bill that the Senate has produced, pretty much under your direction, will achieve the goal of 2,900,000 combat-ready reserve men by 1960?
No, very frankly, I don't, Mr. Hogginson. I don't think that the strongest provisions of the Senate bill and the House bill combined would do it. I don't believe you could reach
Do you think that the original bill that the administration asked would have done it?
Oh, yes, indeed. Because that original bill gave them the power, if the young men could not be obtained by volunteer means, to have inducted them into the service for 6 months training and then put them in the regular reserve.
Well,
it would have furnished them to the reserve just as your selective service bill furnishes them to the regular establishment. And I would have been glad to support that bill. I would have undertaken to have gotten it through the Senate. But we all know, as a realistic political situation here in Washington, that we couldn't have passed the bill through the Congress.
Why do you think that is true? Press checks, polls of public opinion, Pentagon officials, Eisenhower, you, a majority of the Senate, all say that the country favors some form of universal military training. Why do you think that the House has always rejected that?
Well, I've never been able to account for it, Mr. Hogginson, except people who've been in public life know for some time always know that a minority that feels very strongly will remember more through the election period than a majority of the people who don't feel very strongly on it. You can't expect anybody to get out and carry a flag and say, I want to have my son inducted into the service, even though he's willing to have his son discharge his obligation to defend the country. But the people who are opposed to it, they carry a flag. They're very vocal.
Well, if in your opinion this will not produce the intended combat-ready reserve that the military planners have planned on, what about the rather deep cuts being made in the ground forces and in the Marines?
Well, I deplore these reductions that have been made. I think that we have the Department of Administration, rather, has the cart before the horse by making these reductions before we have a strong reserve. I think it subjects us to an unnecessary hazard in this country. We should have had the reserve program first and then brought about the reductions after we had the reserve ready. You can make drastic reductions if you increase your reserve, but that hasn't been done yet.
Do you think this weakens our position in the Big Four conference about to take place in Geneva?
Well, that's all a matter of opinion. It's my own viewpoint that the Russians don't understand but one language, and that's strength. It's force, it's power, it's might. And I think that any man that's negotiating with the Russians is handicapped if he's reducing the strength that's behind his negotiations. I believe, as General Marshall said, that negotiations that are not supported by strength can only result in appeasement. And if you analyze that, you'll see it's just about right.
Senator, you're taking the position that it's absolutely impossible to get any kind of an effective reserve bill through. Is that correct?
Oh, no. You certainly misunderstood me. And I hope that our hearers
you seem to be taking the position
No, I said
now
that we could not achieve the $2,900,000. That's the objective of the bill under these present laws. I think we will greatly strengthen the reserve with the bill that will grow out of this Congress.
Well, Senator, haven't you pulled the teeth on the bill as far as what the administration asked, though, in the Senate, on such things as where the administration had asked for penalties, including other than honorable discharges for reservists who failed to meet their training requirements?
No, that wasn't in either bill.
Well, it wasn't in either bill, but the administration had sought that, and I wondered
now...
No,
the Senate strengthened that provision of the bill.
You would have liked to have seen that in.
We did strengthen, but we didn't go that far. We strengthened it by saying that any man who has had a reserve obligation, didn't conform to it, could be called up for 45 days of active duty each year. So we strengthened the penalty provisions of the bill, but we didn't make it as strong as the administration requested.
Do you think that the administration has made a grave tactical error then in failing to get this reserve program through before they cut the armed forces?
Yes, indeed I do. And I think that they would have been in a much stronger position to have gotten the reserve bill if they had withheld their cuts and told the country every week, just as soon as we can get this reserve program, we can start reducing our regular establishment and start reducing the cost of the military program. I think it was a very grave tactical error, not only from the standpoint of our international relations, but in our domestic affairs.
Senator, in view of the cuts now in the Standing Army and the increasing reliance on the reserve program, are you satisfied with the caliber and the degree of training of the reserve forces?
Well, at the present time, none of the reserve has any, a very small number of the reserve have any real active training. Your National Guard has some. They have the 48 drill periods a year and 2 weeks of summer encampment, and your active reservists do. But we only have about 800,000 active reservists at the present time. We have an authorized strength of 1,500,000 and 800,000 who are actually members. This bill increases the authorized strength to 2,900,000, and we may get up to 1.5 million, the present authorization.
Is there any assurance from the Pentagon that that training program will be stepped up, will be increased? I don't mean just numerically, but in terms of caliber.
Oh, indeed. This bill contemplates that those who come into the Ready Reserve will have 6 months of actual training with a regular component, with the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps.
Senator, I'd like to ask a sort of a general question on this whole matter. Now, you've made it clear many times that you have great misgiving about cutting these ground forces, particularly, as you said before, there is an adequate reserve plan in being. The Democrats, I believe, in general, have taken that line, that these cuts were a mistake. I recall when the military appropriation bill was in the Senate, the Democratic senators, I think, led the fight to put back money to try to avoid a cut in the strength of the Marine Corps. There was, however, no fight made, as I recall it, to put back money to avoid a cut in the Army strength. Can you tell us why that was not done, or what the explanation for that was?
Well, I think it was done. It was not done because we gained the victory by a very narrow margin in the case of the Marine Corps. It was generally understood that we had 6 or 7 senators who had voted for the Marine Corps item who would not vote to restore the Army, and we thought that if the time they would be consumed in losing the fight on the Army might change the composition of the Senate by 2 votes, where a motion to reconsider would cause us to lose what we had won for the Marine Corps. I think it was purely a matter of strategy, the reason why that was not brought forward.
The general question I was coming to was how you regard the responsibility of Congress in these matters as distinguished from that of the President. Do you think that Congress, when it, for example, thinks the President may be wrong about one of these things, one of these divisions of funds, for example, between the services, should take this issue to the end, fight it to the end with him, or do you think that the overriding responsibility rests with him?
Well, the Constitution of the United States says that the responsibility for maintaining and equipping armies is with the Congress.
Yes.
It's not with the President. And very frankly, any president other than Mr. Eisenhower, suppose he's cuts, the Congress never would have gone along with it. The fact that he had led the greatest armies that this world had ever seen, at least in this in recent history, caused the people to trust him more than it did the collective judgment of the Congress.
Then Congress didn't attempt what might have amounted otherwise to a counter veto because they didn't think they could make it stick. Is that it?
That was their sole reason. As I understand it, the Army Amendment was not pressed in the Senate. I don't know about it in the House.
Yes.
I believe it was offered in the House.
Senator Russell, I'd like to shift to another topic, which you're a veteran. If I recall, in 48, you had more than 200 votes as the Democratic nominee for president. In 52, you set up headquarters and had considerably higher number of votes than that. I think in May of this year, you announced that you would not be a candidate for the Democratic nomination this time. All of that is accurate, is it not, sir?
I'm not sure about your months, but substantially you're right.
Well,
I think
I noticed
258 votes I received in 1948 because I did not attend that convention and only gave my consent my name to be presented then an hour or two before it was. I was a candidate in 1952 and was defeated.
I noticed that two of your Democratic colleagues, one of whom sought the nomination last time, Senator Kerr of Oklahoma, also has announced that he is not a candidate this time. And that Senator Symington of Missouri, who's at least been mentioned in the press and over the airwaves as a possible Democratic nominee, also has declared himself out. I wonder if the three of you have, or any group of senators, do have any Senate candidate for the nomination next time.
I don't know that, I don't think there's any Senate candidate as such, Mr. Hawkinson. Of course, you never can tell when a member of the United States Senate is going to run for the presidential nomination.
Well,
it's
Senator,
done quite frequently in both parties.
Hasn't Senator Lyndon Johnson done a remarkable job of unifying the Democratic Party under a rather small majority in the Senate? And hasn't he broken all recent records for getting legislation through and shortening hours and avoiding controversy? I wondered if he might have some support this next time.
Well, Mr. Hawkinson, of course, Senator Johnson has done a superb job as Democratic leader. The man had predicted at the beginning of this year that job could have been done, where people would look upon him with suspicion as to whether he had all of his mental powers. He's done a remarkable job, and I think would make a great president of the United States. I doubt very much whether Senator Johnson will be a candidate in 1956, however.
Senator, who would your choice be for the nomination if you had your...
I don't know that I have any hard and fast choice at the present time. I'll have to wait till we get a little closer down to the nomination
Senator,
period.
in light of your own position on the integration in the schools and so forth, and civil rights generally, I wondered if you would find Governor Harriman a satisfactory candidate. He seems to have quite a little support.
I don't think I want to declare myself in this presidential convention now. He might have come out and say I'm against some man who would not even be a candidate.
Well, I didn't mean against him. I wondered if you would find him satisfactory, or if you thought he would be satisfactory to the people of Georgia.
Well, I am relying on Governor Harriman's statement that he's not a candidate. I read in the paper where he said he was not a candidate, and he was supporting Governor Stevenson, so I certainly shan't go around passing observations on a man who says he's not a candidate.
Senator Hubert Humphrey has been mentioned somewhat by a few of his friends as a candidate for the vice presidential nomination, and he's been rather active in the civil rights. I wondered if you thought he would be acceptable in the South and Georgia.
Senator Humphrey is an exceedingly able man. Of course, the views that he holds in the field which you referred are not those that are held by a majority of the people of the South. They would probably support someone else for the nomination.
Senator Russell,
I don't know that they...
If he received the nomination, do you think
I
that
don't
would
think
be a
that'd
drawback
drive
to the
anybody away
Democratic
from the
Party?
ticket. No, I don't think that'd drive anybody away from the Democratic ticket.
Do you feel Governor Stevenson is stronger in your part of the country now than he was in 52?
I'm inclined to think that he is, Mr. Novin. Yes, I think Governor Stevenson is somewhat strong. He's better known. He's been down to the South. He's been to Atlanta and to Miami and to North Carolina. He's made a number of speeches there, and the people feel that they know him better.
Sir, I wonder if I can switch areas just a little bit and get back to armed services, one aspect of it. In your opinion, are we maintaining a position of strength, of leadership, in comparison with Russia?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I think that we are maintaining our leadership in the all-important field of nuclear weapons. We have never sought to keep up with the Russians and ground forces. That's impossible. We'd bankrupt us because American private, not a private first class, but American private, gets practically the equivalent pay of a Russian brigadier general. We just can't afford to match them on ground forces. But we have, by maintaining our lead in the field of atomic and hydrogen weapons and in the means to deliver them,
Does that include
maintained
intercontinental-
our overall supremacy. Now, of course, the Russians are making vast progress in that field, and no one knows just when they will overtake us. I don't think they have
Senator.
yet, but they are making great progress. And it'd be very little reassurance to us to have 10,000 bombs if the Russians had 1,000, because 1,000 could destroy practically the ability to wage war industrially of either country.
Senator.
I'd like to ask this question along the same line. It's a little blunt, but I'd like to put it this way because I'd like to have your reaction to it. Do you think, taking everything into consideration, the military balances you've been discussing and all the rest, that this decision of the President's to go to Geneva was a wise decision or not?
Well, only history can answer that question, Mr. White. I don't see how, in the circumstances, the President could have refused to go, because the United States cannot be placed in a position of not being willing to explore every avenue that will lead to a reduction in this terrible burden of armaments and in atmosphere of more peaceful relations between the peoples of the earth. I don't see how he could have refused to have gone if the meeting had been set up under other circumstances and he'd been invited. And if that was going to happen, it was just as well that we participated in it. What we've got to do is to be very careful about what takes place at Geneva. And I have faith that the President and Mr. Dulles will be careful.
Relating my question, Senator, to your own field, which is responsibility for legislation, and, for example, this legislation we've been discussing, assuming the Big Four conference ends inconclusively, it ends with some aspect of hope, but with no settlement, as apparently most people believe it will end. As a practical matter, will not the atmosphere there created make it more difficult to prepare, for example, the adequate reserve you've been discussing today?
It might have that effect, Mr. White, but I believe that the American people are very intelligent now in the field of international relations. I think that they would certainly welcome some great news from Geneva that we'd made progress, but I don't believe they really expect it. I think that they think it's going to be a long and tortuous path that we'll have to travel over many years to really achieve what is the immediate goal at Geneva. And I don't believe that they're going to be lulled in any sense of false security that'll cause them to clamor to reduce the Army and Navy until we're really out of danger. If we do, well, we'll be destroyed. And
Senator,
we deserve to be destroyed.
Senator, you're in a position, as good a position as anyone, to know about the strength of our armed forces. There's been considerable publicity about the fact that we are lagging behind the Russians on air power, and there have been stories stating specifically on certain types of fighters that were way behind in numbers, and that as far as long-range bombers are concerned, we're quite a long ways behind. I wonder if there's anything to that, or...
Well, it's cause for concern, the progress that the Russians have made. They've developed some long-range jet bombers that we didn't expect them to have for several years. We have consistently underestimated the ability of the Russians in the fields of technology and production.
Well, what have you been doing
We
about
didn't even know that, for example, the Russians had a jet plane like the MiG until we met it in the air over Korea. We have consistently underestimated it. Well, the Armed Service Committee of the Senate they've done all that we can do. We have urged the executive branch to make greater effort in the field of production and in research. I'm not at all satisfied with the amount of research that we're doing.
What's the
today.
reason for the failures, Senator, to keep up?
Well, I think
Pride
it's been the fact that we have been a little too complacent over the superiority as manifested by our airmen in Korea. We undoubtedly have the greatest pilots in the world, and that one thing gives us a great advantage. But we have thought too much too in terms of the dollar rather than of national security. It's a gamble. Personally, I've never been willing to gamble very much on the adequate protection of this country.
Well, Senator, why do these things come as a surprise? Is intelligence faulty?
Well, of course, a Russian can read more about our military establishment in a weekly paper here, and not to speak of our great daily press, than we can get with all the effort that we can make behind the Iron Curtain. That's it's just a very difficult problem. Just the difference between a free country like ours and a slave state like that's found in communist countries. What we do is practically open to the world. We
Senator,
keep
would you
some
want
of
to
the
change that?
technological secrets, but not many. No, I wouldn't swap our
well, I mean, in
liberties and
any respect.
our way of life for the advantage it might accrue from having an Iron Curtain, but a people that were all chained to the wheel of state.
Senator, I'd like to ask this question along the line of what might be called high policy. Our primary military and foreign policy has been based for years, has it not, on the assumption that in the air and with the atomic weapon, we had a means of retaliation so great that the Russians would not choose to make aggressive actions in Europe or here. Now, you've said here that you are concerned about their unsuspected progress in this same field, in the field of the same weapon field. Is there anything in this to make you think that the whole basis of our policy must now be changed in light of all this?
I think it all should be reevaluated in the light of information that we have just obtained in the last several months. And we are reevaluating. We are stepping up our program, both in the production of the B-52, the long-range jet bomber, and our newest model of fighter planes.
Senator Russell, thank you very much for facing the nation, answering questions from our
Thank you. I
panel.
enjoyed being on the program with this panel.
Our panel, William White of the New York Times, Edwin Hackinson of the Associated Press, and Clark Molinoff of the Des Moines Register and Tribune. This program has come from Washington, the nation's capital.
Stuart Novins was your moderator today on Face the Nation. Your director, Robert Quinn. Associated in production, Nancy Huntsman. Produced by Ted Ayers. Today on the CBS Public Affairs program, you saw through the eyes of this live television camera Senator Richard B. Russell, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Face the Nation. Next week, see another figure prominent on the American political scene, Face the Nation. Al Stepler speaking.
This is the CBS Television Network.